The letter was already on the table when they called me in. I noticed it the moment I sat down, face down, as though the sight of it too soon might unsettle the proceedings. Patrick Graves, my line manager of 3 years, leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who had already decided how things would end. The human resources officer beside him kept her eyes fixed on the window throughout. Nobody offered me water. Nobody offered me anything. My name is Cora Mills. At that point in my life, I was in my mid-20s, a junior marketing analyst at Crestwell Industries, a corporate management firm in central Birmingham. I had been there for just over 2 years. I was considered reliable, capable, the sort of person a team leans on without ever quite acknowledging. I was also pregnant at 11 weeks. Barely showing. But enough. Patrick did not say the word. He slid the letter across the table. "You're a liability," he said. "It's not personal. It's business." He did not look at me. He looked at his hands. A viewer named Danielle wrote in to ask, "Has anyone ever made you feel as though your very existence was the problem, not your work, not your manner, just you?" Danielle, hold that question. Because that is precisely what that room felt like. Then came the sound I will never forget. A low, brief laugh from somewhere behind Patrick's shoulder, one of 2 colleagues standing in the open doorway. Another voice joined it. Short. Dismissive. As though they found it faintly amusing that I was still sitting there. I did not cry. I said thank you, I still cannot fully account for that, collected my bag, and walked out into the grey Birmingham morning. It was only in the car park, standing alone in the drizzle, that my body finally accepted what my mind had been refusing. It was over. Or so they believed. I sat in my car for a long time. I am not sure exactly how long, long enough for the windows to fog completely, long enough for the car park to empty around me, long enough for my phone to buzz twice with messages I could not yet face. The engine had grown cold before I finally reached for the phone. There was no savings buffer to fall back on. What little I had put aside had gone on the deposit for my flat the previous spring. There was no partner, that relationship had ended quietly 2 months before I found out I was pregnant, and I had chosen not to reach back out. There was no plan beyond getting up each morning and going to work. And now even that was gone. I called my sister Ruth. We had never been especially close, there was a 4-year gap between us and a considerably wider emotional one, but she was the only family I had in the city. Her phone rang 5 times before she answered. I could hear the television in the background, the familiar sound of her living room on a weekday afternoon. I told her what had happened. There was a pause that stretched well beyond what any pause should have. "Cora," she said at last, I can't get involved in this right now. It's complicated. You know how things are." I did not know how things were. I knew only that the pause had already told me everything before the words arrived. I said goodbye. I sat with the dead phone in my hand, watching the condensation slide slowly down the inside of the windscreen. I was entirely alone. I drove to Professor Elaine Forsyth's house without making a conscious decision to do so. Professor Forsyth had been my lecturer during my 2nd year at Coventry University, business strategy, delivered with the kind of unsentimental precision that either terrified students or galvanized them. I had been galvanized. On the morning I graduated, she had pressed her business card into my hand and said, without warmth but with absolute sincerity, "You will need someone who tells you the truth one day. Come to me when that day arrives." That day had arrived. She lived in a narrow terraced house a short drive from the university, its front garden slightly overgrown, a stack of academic journals visible through the bay window. I knocked before I could change my mind. She took a long moment to come to the door. When it opened, she studied me with the particular attention she had always given to problems she had not yet finished solving. Her eyes moved from my face to my coat, which I had pulled close against the cold, and back again. "You didn't fail," she said quietly, as though she had already read the summary of events. "Someone discarded you. Those are not the same thing." She stood aside and let me in. The house smelled of strong tea and old books. She filled the kettle without asking whether I wanted anything, and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the same still, precise attention she had always given her best students. "I'll help you," she said. "But I need one thing from you first." I waited. "If I invest in you, you do not get to quit halfway through. Whatever comes, you see it to the end. That is my only condition." I looked at her steadily. "Agreed," I said. The weeks that followed were a lesson in the particular cruelty of necessity. I registered with a temp agency in the city center and took whatever came: data entry, reception cover, and administrative filing. The pay was low, the work was thankless, and traveling across Birmingham by bus in December, with morning sickness that struck at any hour it chose, was a private ordeal I shared with no one. But I went. Every morning, without exception, I went. Professor Forsyth had helped me apply for a bursary through Coventry's Alumni Support Fund, which covered the shortfall in my rent and made the difference between keeping the flat and losing it. It was not generosity offered easily, she had made that perfectly clear, but it was offered, and I took it without shame. The hardest moments came in the evenings. I would find myself scrolling through my old professional connections online, former colleagues from Crestwell Industries, people I had worked alongside for 2 years, trained alongside, and shared a narrow kitchen with on the 4th floor. Their profiles glowed with announcements. Promotions. New titles. A company away day was photographed somewhere in the golden Cotswolds light. Some of those faces had been standing in the doorway on the morning they fired me. Some of them had laughed. There they were, celebrated, advancing, entirely unbothered. I did not allow myself self-pity. That is not the same as saying it did not hurt. It hurt the way cold water hurts, not because it is unfair, but because the body registers it regardless of whether you choose to acknowledge it. But self-pity was a luxury I had already decided I could not carry. I turned the phone face down and returned to the job applications I had spread across the kitchen table. There was simply no other option. I collapsed at work on a Wednesday afternoon in late January. One moment I was at a photocopier in an open-plan office near Broad Street, feeding documents into the machine, and the next I was on the floor with cold carpet against my cheek and a ring of unfamiliar faces above me. The paramedics were efficient and kind. At the hospital, a nurse pulled the curtain closed around my bed and sat beside me with the manner of someone who had witnessed this particular situation before. "You're dehydrated," she said carefully. "And severely fatigued. You need to rest." "I don't have that option," I told her. She did not argue. She simply looked at me for a moment with a directness that suggested years of watching people push themselves past every sensible limit. "What do you actually want?" she asked. "Not what you need to manage this week. What do you want for yourself, for your child, when you allow yourself to imagine the future properly?" I stared at the ceiling tiles for a long time. I had been living entirely in the immediate, the next rent payment, the next bus fare, the next shift. I had compressed my life down to its smallest possible shape in order to survive, and in doing so, I had nearly forgotten that survival was not supposed to be the destination. It was only the beginning of something. Not the end of it. Lying there in that hospital cubicle, with the curtain swaying faintly in the draft from the corridor, something inside me shifted. Something that had been very small and very quiet began, with considerable caution, to grow. Surviving was not enough. I needed to build. Professor Forsyth did not waste time on sentiment. 2 weeks after I left the hospital, she placed a printed document on the kitchen table between us and told me to read it before I said a single word. It was the application form for the Crestwell Business Leadership Scholarship, a competitive program offering a fully funded postgraduate qualification in business management, structured mentorship, and a year's placement within a corporate partner organization. The sponsoring company's name was printed at the top of the first page. Crestwell Industries. I set the form down. I looked at her. "You cannot be serious," I said. "I am entirely serious," Professor Forsyth replied. "The assessment is blind through the first 2 rounds, no names, no photographs, no institutional affiliation. They evaluate your written submission and your business proposal before they ever set eyes on you. They will not know who you are until you walk through their door." I considered this. And then? I asked. And then, she said, you will have already impressed them enough that it will be too late for any of it to matter. I looked at the form again. The deadline was in 3 weeks. The program was competitive, 12 places from a pool of typically several hundred applicants. The business proposal component required demonstrating applied knowledge of corporate communications strategy. I had 2 years of that knowledge. Gathered at their expense, inside their own building. Why would I go back in there? I asked. Professor Forsyth considered this with her customary patience. Because, she said, the most effective response to being dismissed is to use every resource available to you, including theirs, to become someone who can no longer be dismissed. I reached for the pen. On the morning I returned to Crestwell Industries, I arrived 20 minutes early. I stood on the opposite pavement first, looking up at that familiar glass facade, the revolving doors, the security desk just visible through the entrance. 16 months had passed since they had walked me out. In that time I had given birth to my daughter, brought her home to a flat that was barely large enough for 2, and assembled an entire scholarship application between night feeds and 12-hour temp shifts. I had read every text on Professor Forsyth's recommended list. I had rewritten my business proposal until it no longer sounded like desperation. I crossed the road and went inside. The receptionist was the same woman, a bright orange lanyard, neatly kept nails, the watchful manner of someone practiced at redirecting people without an appointment. She did not look at me twice. I gave my application reference as instructed and waited. The interview room was on the 3rd floor. The panel was already seated when I entered, 4 people, expensive pens, the collective air of those accustomed to making swift assessments. I recognized one of them the moment I sat down. He was at the far left of the table, heavier now than I remembered, with reading glasses he had not worn before and a slightly looser jacket. But the angle of the jaw was identical. The particular quality of detachment in his posture was unmistakable. He had been standing in the doorway on the morning they fired me. He had been the first to laugh. I placed my folder on the table, looked at each of them in turn, and smiled with complete and unhurried composure. He did not recognize me. I watched carefully for it, the small involuntary adjustment of expression that comes when recognition arrives somewhere it was not expected. It never came. I was, to him, a reference number and a face across a conference table. No more than that. I answered the panel's questions methodically and without hurry. The business proposal I had spent 3 weeks refining addressed a measurable gap in mid-market corporate communications strategy, specifically the kind of gap I had identified during 2 years of working on under-resourced projects at Crestwell. I knew the industry from the inside. I knew their blind spots intimately. I simply chose not to announce any of that. I spoke clearly, backed every point with evidence, and when one panel member, a brisk woman on the right-hand side who seemed constitutionally suspicious of optimism, challenged my financial modeling, I walked her through my assumptions one at a time until she made a note and moved on. At the end of the session, the man from the doorway leaned back and addressed his colleague rather than me directly. "Strong candidate," he said. "Very strong." He said it as though I were not entirely present in the room, as though the assessment were a private conversation I had merely been adjacent to. It was a small moment. It looked like nothing at all. But I felt something settle in me with a clarity I had not anticipated, quiet, clean, and entirely uncomplicated. The man who had once laughed at the sight of me standing humiliated and pregnant had just told his colleagues I was exceptional. He had done so without the faintest idea of what he was saying. I thanked the panel, gathered my folder, and walked back to the lift. I allowed myself one very small smile on the way down. I was awarded the scholarship. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning while my daughter slept in her pram beside the kitchen table. I read it twice, then a third time, set it down, and sat for a moment with both hands flat on the table. The program ran for 18 months. The funding covered tuition fees, a study allowance, and a modest but sufficient contribution towards living costs. What it could not cover was the sheer weight of those 18 months, the early starts, the late nights, the case studies read on my phone on the bus between the childminder and the library, the lectures replayed twice through exhaustion because I had not been able to retain them the first time. I finished with a distinction. That was not the end of the work. It was the beginning of the next chapter of it. Over the years that followed, I built a career in corporate consultancy, slowly, methodically, and entirely on the strength of what I could demonstrate, because I had no family connections in the industry and no financial cushion beneath me. I moved through 3 firms over several years, taking on progressively more complex engagements, expanding my understanding of organizations in difficulty, how they failed, how they concealed failure, and what genuine recovery required. My daughter grew. She started school. She lost her first tooth. She developed the habit of asking, as children do, increasingly precise questions about the world. And the whisper that had kept me moving through the worst of it, the memory of a room going quiet, and a man looking at me as though I were disposable, I never put it away. I carried it like a compass. Every difficult meeting, every boardroom I was not expected to hold my own in. I carried it. It was a Tuesday evening, well over a decade after the morning they fired me, when Professor Forsyth told me something she had been sitting on for considerably longer. My daughter was asleep in the next room, her homework abandoned on the kitchen table. Professor Forsyth had come for supper and had accepted a second glass of wine, which was unusual. She was not a person who chose her moments carelessly. "There is something you should know about Crestwell Industries," she said. Over several years, she explained, through a former colleague in financial regulation and a contact at a business journalism publication who had been building a case of their own, she had been quietly assembling a picture of the company's internal conduct. The pattern she described was long-running and systematic. Expenses channeled through subsidiary accounts. Performance metrics were manipulated to protect certain senior figures, whilst others were removed. Staff dismissed on questionable grounds in deliberate advance of audit periods. I sat very still. "You were not the only one," she said. "But your case was among the most clearly documented." I thought about the human resources officer who had not looked at me once during that meeting. I thought about the letter, face down on the table. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Professor Forsyth set her glass down with the deliberateness of someone who has been approaching a conclusion for a very long time. "Because you are ready," she said. "And because organizations like Crestwell do not fall under their own weight. Someone has to be in the right position, someone who understands both the law and the balance sheet, and who has absolutely nothing left to prove." She looked at me steadily across the table. "You qualify," she said. Several years after that conversation, I joined Fortis Consulting. I had spent the intervening time in roles that expanded my understanding of everything I needed: financial governance, operational risk, regulatory compliance, and the particular skill of reading an organization's internal culture from the shape of its own documentation. By the time I walked into Fortis's offices in central London for my final interview, I was not the nervous candidate I had once been sitting across from a scholarship panel. I was a senior professional who had spent years doing precisely the kind of work they needed. Josephine Ware, the senior partner who conducted my interview, was a compact, precise woman whose manner reminded me, in the most useful possible way, of Professor Forsyth. She did not offer compliments, nor did she invite them. She asked what I believed broken organizations most frequently got wrong. I told her they confused restructuring with accountability, that they moved things around without ever genuinely addressing what had caused the collapse in the first place. She made a brief note and offered me the position. I joined as a senior associate. 14 months into my time at Fortis, my team was assigned a new client engagement. I was at my desk on a gray Wednesday morning when the briefing document arrived in my inbox. I opened it without ceremony, expecting another struggling mid-tier logistics firm or a regional retailer in difficulty, the sorts of cases that came across the desk routinely at the associate level. I read the client's name at the top of the page. Crestwell Industries. I closed the document. I sat for a moment looking at the wall, then I opened it again from the beginning, slowly and with complete attention. They were in serious trouble. And they needed help, they did not yet understand. My first visit to Crestwell Industries as a Fortis Consulting senior associate was unlike any of my previous ones. I walked through the revolving doors with a visitor badge issued in my full name, was collected in the lobby by an assistant who did not keep me waiting, and was escorted directly to the 4th floor. The same floor I had once worked on. The layout had changed, the kitchen was in a different position, the furniture was newer, but some of the faces were familiar, glimpsed briefly in corridors and through glass partitions. None of them recognized me. Why would they? I was an external consultant carrying a leather document case, wearing a suit that had once cost considerably more than a month of temp agency wages. The woman who had been handed a termination letter in this building bore no visible resemblance to the one standing in it now. Nobody laughed. My team conducted a full operational and financial audit over the following 6 weeks. I was assigned the communications and marketing division, my original area of expertise, though I made no mention of that, and I moved through the files with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has nothing to conceal and nothing to prove. What I found confirmed everything Professor Forsyth had described over supper that Tuesday evening, and considerably more besides. The pattern was not dramatic at first glance. But it was consistent, deep, and had been running for a long time. Resources misallocated. Reviews falsified. Certain members of staff were removed in advance of reporting periods, people whose presence would have made unavoidable questions unavoidable. I documented everything with complete and methodical precision. Then I took the full picture to Josephine Ware and placed it in front of her. Josephine read my report without expression. That was not unusual. She read most things that way, but I had worked alongside her long enough to understand the particular texture of her silences, and this was the silence of someone who had received something significant and was taking the full measure of it. "You are confident in all of this," she said, when she had finished. "Entirely," I said. She placed the report carefully on her desk. By that point, Crestwell's situation had deteriorated considerably. The regulatory scrutiny Professor Forsyth had first flagged years earlier had begun to surface in the financial press, not yet named directly, but unmistakable to anyone with the right knowledge. Several major clients had reduced their contracts or moved on altogether. The share price had fallen twice in 3 months. The board was fractured in the way boards always fracture when an organization begins to understand that its problems are not structural but cultural. They were desperate. 2 days after I submitted my findings, Josephine and I were invited to present them to the full board. I sat at the edge of the conference table and watched the members read through the summary document in silence. The quiet in that room reminded me, uncomfortably, of a different room on a different morning. When the chairman, a silver-haired man named Sir Geoffrey Moss, who carried the bearing of someone accustomed to managing serious situations, looked up from the final page, he directed his question not to Josephine but to me. "Can you fix this?" he asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," I said. I already knew, even as I said it, precisely where I intended to begin. Restructuring begins quietly when it is done correctly. There is a particular unease that moves through any organization when people sense change coming but cannot yet see its shape. Rumors move faster than any formal communication. People begin recalculating their positions, watching for signals, deciding which relationships will hold and which will not. I let that unease move. Managing anxiety was not my responsibility. Evidenced accountability was. Over the following 10 weeks, 3 senior executives were removed from their positions. Each case was thoroughly documented, handled entirely through the company's own governance procedures with Fortis Consulting as external oversight, and conducted with legal precision throughout. 2 departures were quiet. The third made considerable noise, which his legal advisors persuaded him to cease once the evidence available was made plain. Patrick Graves still had his office on the 2nd floor. I had been careful not to move too quickly in his direction. He was not the most senior person implicated, he was, in many respects, a middle layer, someone who had carried out a pattern established well above him. That did not make him uninvolved. It simply meant that his turn required the correct sequence, built on a foundation that could not be challenged later. His name appeared twice in the documentation I was constructing, attached to specific decisions I had traced back through the paper trail with considerable patience. One morning, a member of his closest team, a woman who had been, by all the evidence, his most willing collaborator, was escorted from the building carrying a cardboard box. She did not look back as she went. The whispers in the office grew noticeably louder. The ground beneath Patrick Graves was beginning to shift, and he had not yet understood it. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 months into the engagement, when Patrick Graves finally saw me. Not noticed me, saw me. There is a meaningful distinction between the two. He had walked past me in the corridor more than once already, with the automatic acknowledgement of someone who cannot quite place a face and does not particularly care to resolve that. I was an external consultant. Part of the general disruption. Something to be tolerated. But that Thursday, I was standing in the open plan area on the second floor, speaking with 2 of his remaining team members about a workflow I needed them to walk me through. He came out of his office and stopped. I finished my sentence first. I thanked the 2 analysts, made a note on the page in front of me, and then turned around. He was looking at me with the expression of a man solving an equation he had not been told he would need to solve. I could see it moving across his face, the initial uncertainty, the slow assembly of pieces, and then the particular stillness that arrives when recognition carries consequences with it. "You," he said. It was barely a word. More of a sound, the beginning of something his composure would not quite allow him to finish. "Yes," I said simply. I held his gaze, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the level, unhurried attention of someone who has absolutely nothing further to establish. Then I looked back down at my notes, made another mark on the page, and continued with my work. He said nothing else. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer, then turned and returned to his office. He did not laugh. The board meeting was called without warning on a Friday morning. I was already in the building when the notification went out, a brief, formal message requesting the immediate attendance of all board members in the main conference suite on the 6th floor. No agenda was distributed with it. No explanation offered. In my experience, that particular administrative silence means one of 2 things: something has gone catastrophically wrong, or a decision has already been reached and what remains is only its announcement. I was asked to attend in an advisory capacity. The room, when I entered it, had the atmosphere of a space where argument has already reached its point of exhaustion. Board members were clustered in informal groups rather than seated in a single arrangement, a reliable indicator of a divided room. 2 clear factions, roughly equal in size, both visibly worn. Sir Geoffrey Moss opened the meeting without preamble. The company required new leadership. The chief executive had tendered his resignation the previous evening, a fact not yet made public. The board had spent the preceding hours considering both internal and external candidates and had arrived, after considerable disagreement, at a consensus position. Names were offered across the table. Argued over. Set aside one by one as each accumulated objections. It could not survive, too closely associated with the previous regime, too inexperienced for a crisis of this specific character, too compromised by what had already come to light. The argument thinned. And then someone offered a name that had not been part of any prior conversation. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, not the quiet of exhaustion, but the quiet of a space reconsidering itself entirely. Sir Geoffrey looked across the table at me. Sir Geoffrey Moss stood up. The room had the quality of a held breath. Even the board members who had been murmuring amongst themselves a moment before went still. Patrick Graves sat 2 seats to my left, permitted to attend in a reduced advisory capacity. He had arranged his posture with the particular care of a man anticipating good news, preparing to receive it with appropriate composure. Sir Geoffrey straightened his jacket. "The board has reached its decision," he said, "and we are unanimous." A small, anticipatory adjustment moved across Patrick's expression. He had, I was aware, been cultivating 2 board members informally over the preceding weeks. He had begun to construct a private narrative in which the disruption cleared the layers above him, leaving him closer to a position he had long believed he deserved. Sir Geoffrey turned slightly in my direction. "Cora Mills," he said, "the board is asking you to serve as the new Chief Executive Officer of Crestwell Industries." The silence that followed that sentence was unlike any other silence in that room. It had weight. It pressed against the walls and against the chest of every person sitting within them. I did not look at Patrick immediately. I looked at Sir Geoffrey. "I accept," I said quietly. When I finally did look across the table, every trace of color had left Patrick's face. His mouth had opened slightly, as though the announcement had removed his ability to close it. He had once looked at me as something to be managed and discarded without consequence. That silence was louder than any laughter he had ever produced. The shock moved through the room in a wave. I watched it travel, not with triumph, but with the careful attention of someone who has spent many years learning to observe rather than react. 2 board members exchanged a glance. One nodded with the expression of a person for whom something has finally resolved itself. Another reached for her water glass and held it without drinking, as though requiring something to hold. Patrick Graves did not move for a long moment. Then he leaned slightly towards the board member to his right, the one he had been most carefully cultivating, and said, in a tone that was barely a whisper but was perfectly audible in a room that had grown that quiet, "Her." One word. The same quality of disbelief that had been in his laughter years before, stripped now of its contempt and left with only its confusion. I did not react. I did not smile. I did not change my expression by a single degree. I reached forward, moved the chair at the head of the conference table, the chair that had been occupied, until the previous evening, by a chief executive who had built his entire career on the very culture I had spent months dismantling, and sat down in it. I opened the folder I had brought with me. I looked at the room. "Thank you," I said. "I would like to begin with the restructuring timeline. I have specific proposals I would like to walk you through." The meeting continued. The table I had never been meant to sit at was, from that moment, mine. I did not make a spectacle of it. That matters, I think, because people sometimes imagine that the moment of reversal, the point at which the person who was discarded becomes the one with authority, arrives with some form of deliberate ceremony. A reckoning. A speech. A public confrontation designed to make the meaning unmistakable to everyone watching. It does not happen that way. It should not. I restructured Crestwell Industries over the following 14 months. The process was methodical, evidenced at every stage, and grounded entirely in the findings my team had documented. Those who were removed were not dismissed by me personally, they were removed through the company's own governance procedures, all of it legally precise and fully documented. I was scrupulous about that. The law was the instrument, not my satisfaction. The staff who remained were, in the main, people who had simply been working in an organization whose leadership had been corroding around them without their knowledge or meaningful involvement. They were not responsible for what had been built above them. They needed stability and direction, not further disruption, and I was there to provide it. Patrick Graves was escorted from the building on a Wednesday morning in March, 8 months after my appointment as Chief Executive Officer. I was in a meeting on the 6th floor when it occurred. I had not arranged to witness it. I had not adjusted my schedule to mark the occasion in any way. I learned of it the way one learns of most things in an office, through the particular quality of quiet that settles when something irreversible has happened. I noted it. I returned to the document in front of me. This had never been about revenge. It had always been about what was right. Several years have passed since that Wednesday in March. The office I work in now looks nothing like what I imagined during those months of temp shifts, night feeds, and recorded lectures listened to through cheap earphones on early morning buses. It is quieter than I expected. There is a photograph on my desk of my daughter at her last birthday, laughing at something just outside the frame. She is 13 now, in secondary school, and she carries the easy confidence of a child who has never had cause to question whether she is valued. She comes in after school sometimes, drops her bag, borrows a biscuit from the tin I keep in the bottom drawer for no particular reason, and tells me about her day with the uncomplicated assumption that I will always have time for her. I always do. I often think about the car park. The gray drizzle. The moment my legs gave way on that Birmingham morning was when the weight of everything finally reached me. I think about Professor Forsyth's kitchen table, and the scholarship form pushed across it without ceremony, as though my future were simply a problem that required the correct approach. I think about a hospital ceiling, and a nurse who asked what I actually wanted. And I think about a man who once looked at a pregnant woman across a desk and laughed as she walked out of a door he had just closed behind her. I think, quietly, to the person I was standing alone in that car park, you were wrong about me. All of you were entirely wrong about me. If this story reached you today, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a thought in the comments below. And if you are standing in your own car park right now, hold on. You have no idea how far you are going to go. Thank you for watching.